When Corey contacted me a couple weeks ago and said, I guess I interpreted it basically as, help! To say that the person who was supposed to do the Fridays and Saturday evening lessons and Sunday morning wasn't going to be able to do it. Would I take this lesson? And I thought, oh, okay, great. But I didn't warn him. After supper, I'm not great. When we were still living in Abilene, going to school, Diana had gotten married in December, and I was invited to go over and speak for a congregation in over toward Fort Worth. And we got there, this young couple in their early 20s, and they, those country folk really like to put on a good spread. And we went home with this older couple. They're probably younger than Diana and I now, but we went home with this older couple, and she put out enough food to feed about 10, 15 people for just the four of us. And I thought, ooh, and then mercifully said, now, you probably would like to lie down and have a nap. And, okay. And then they woke us up a little while later and said, okay, we need to grab a bite before we go. And the whole spread appeared again. And only this time they didn't invite us to go take a nap. They said, now you got to go preach. And I learned my lesson at that point about being very careful how much you eat before you preach. So, but I really enjoyed the tacos, and I kind of laughed because guess what Diana and I had for lunch. So, but that's never a problem for me. Okay, I love the theme for this series, The World at Our Doorstep, and I just want to begin by sharing one simple thing. I was just curious, and I started with the Google search, and I put into Google, I said, how many people in Manitoba, or in Winnipeg, are from other parts of the world? Or I think the wording was I can't remember how I worded it now, but the answer came back 100 different nationalities, different ethnic groupings. And I thought, okay, well, what about Manitoba? And the answer came back, and I was floored, and I thought, no, that can't be right. So I went to the Stats Can webpage, and I put the same question into Stats Can about people who cite their origin as being other than Canada. And it came up with the same answer. Have you ever thought about it? The answer is about 200. The world has come to Manitoba. And you can't go very far without coming across people who are from other places. And that has so enriched our life here in Manitoba. Now, earlier today, Vince got us started by talking about the God who moves nations, and then Leslie did overcoming fear of the other. And great lessons, guys. I didn't talk to you afterward, but I figured I could compliment you from the front, because that you guys really set the table for what I want to say tonight. I was a little anxious about whether you would preach my sermon for me, but so we're talking about the theology of captivity. That's the way the assignment was given to me. Gloria had given it the title, and I thought, oh boy, that sounds like as exciting as watching grass grow. And so I appreciate y'all sticking around after dinner so we can think about this from a very serious standpoint. Now, theology basically means, it's from Greek, it means the study of God. So theology is word, but it means study. And sometimes it's actually the study about God, and sometimes it's the study, as we're doing tonight, about God's thoughts or a word about a particular thing. But we want to talk about hospitality. And you probably have a whole lot of ideas about that. One of the first things I thought about when I think about the word hospitality is its related word is hospital. And then I wondered, is it because of hospitality you have a hospital? The word hospital and hospitality come from the Latin word hospice, which means stranger or guest. And you can see how that relates to the idea of hospital and hospitality. And even in some cases, apparently, from some of the one source I looked at, said that hospice can also refer to the host. So it's a pretty broad idea that we get from that. Oxford Dictionary says hospitality is the friendly and generous reception and entertainment of guests, visitors, and strangers. Now think about that. The friendly and generous reception and entertainment of guests, visitors, and strangers. Now, what we want to do is kind of talk a little Old Testament background here. And so, as Jesus was going around teaching, and somebody came up to him and asked him about what is the most important command? And he said, the most important one is this: Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is this: love your neighbor as yourself. Why are those the two? Well, if you think about the Ten Commandments, they're all summed up in those two: to love God and to love your neighbor. A lawyer came up to Jesus and asked him, or Jesus asked him, and the lawyer said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. You kind of see that that's a very well-entrenched idea. In fact, the first part of that is called the Shema. It comes in Deuteronomy chapter 6. And it's interesting, if you look at Judaism, you'll find that Shema is repeated several times each day. And they actually consider it to be a prayer, which is kind of interesting to me, because I don't see in it quite the language of prayer. But to love your neighbor as yourself comes from Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18. And kind of mentally keep a thumb finger in your mind on Leviticus 19, because we're going to come back to that. But the next, or the previous verse, talking about your neighbor, says don't hate, don't seek revenge, don't bear a grudge. You kind of see the behaviors that are not acceptable toward your neighbor. So the question becomes, well, who is my neighbor? Well, Leviticus 19, you got your finger in there, refers to your fellow Israelite. Verse 18, one of your people. So you understand how family and friends and people like me kind of come into the thinking. And that kind of seems to be what the lawyer has in mind when he says, who is my neighbor? But how did Jesus answer? Well, he told a parable, didn't he? What parable? Parable of the Good Samaritan. I think somebody's touching that tomorrow. The Samaritans were not Jewish, but they were religiously close. They followed the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. But they were ethnically impure. And so there's a great animosity between the Jews and the Samaritans. Yet, interesting. What about aliens? If these people that are so close to you, you love, and there's animosity to the Samaritans, what about those who are just totally outside that, who are just fully, undoubtedly, what would be called Gentiles? Well, this is where it gets interesting, because go back to that same chapter of Leviticus 19. When a foreigner resides among you in your land, do not mistreat him. The foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. You treat him just like everybody else. You treat him just like your brothers and sisters. You treat him like your fellow Jews. Love them as yourself. Where does Leviticus 19 say, love your neighbor as yourself? So you love the alien and the stranger among you as much as you love your neighbor, as much as you love yourself. That's a powerful idea, isn't it? Okay, so in the church, interesting, and we've had some really good history about the early church and the dynamics about this. The day of Pentecost, Luke says that there were Jews from every nation under heaven. Now think about that. The spread of the Jewish nation around, and they all come because Pentecost is one of the pilgrimage feasts. So they've all come in there from all over the world. As he says, every nation under heaven. And so we have that powerful demonstration of God's Spirit. 3,000 baptized that day. And that beautiful picture that they can, about the community of the early church that existed. Until we go a little bit further and we find that the differences, especially between what are referred to as the Greek or Grecian widows and what would be the Aramaic. They're culturally different, even though they are religiously the same. But they're saying that the widows are being ignored. And so the Greek group is becoming very incensed and upset. And so the apostles appoint 7. We refer to them as the first deacons because they are appointed to serve, which is that Greek word deacon. Now one of them is a man named Philip. And Philip, after we see him here, next he pops up down in Samaria, and we have him taking the gospel to the Samaritan. The Ethiopian. After that, he heads up for Caesarea. And late in Acts, when we see him again, he's in Caesarea, he has a house, and he's married and has children. Because it talks about his daughters. So Philip was quite involved in you want to call it the multicultural outreach. The story of Cornelius, and we won't go back through this, but when Peter gets back to Jerusalem, he went into the house of uncircumcised men and ate with them. Imagine your crime. You ate with somebody. And see how incensed and upset they are. And so, as we have the case of as Leslie talked about, the Jerusalem Council and the letter that they produced, but I want to just pull out a quote here from what James said in the course of the discussion. So when they finished, James spoke up, "Brothers, listen to me. Simon has described to us how God first intervened to choose a people for his name from the Gentiles." In Jewish circles, that would have been heresy. God chose a people for his name from the Gentiles. They are hanging on the idea that the Jews are God's chosen people. The words of the prophets are in agreement with this, as it is written. "After this, I will return and rebuild David's fallen tent. Its ruins I will rebuild, I will restore it, that the rest of mankind may seek the Lord, even all the Gentiles who bear my name, says the Lord, who does these things known from long ago." Now, I'll just point out something here. It's where it says Gentiles, the Greek word is ethnos. Ethnic, you see how that comes down? In other words, it means the nations, but when it's put alongside the Jews, it tends to refer to the non-Jews, which were referred to as the Gentiles. So, Hebrews 13, 1 and 2. Very interesting. Because we see the thinking from what's going on in Jerusalem back then, many, many years later, being shared. And so the writer of Hebrews says, keep on loving one another as brothers and sisters. Okay? Good. And actually in the Greek there's only 3 words here. One of them is an article. Article are words like the and a and a. But basically just say love the brothers. And then in the next verse, do not forget to show hospitality to strangers. For by so doing, some people have shown hospitality to angels without knowing. Now, another Greek thing here, but I think it's really kind of interesting. It will help you maybe remember this. The Greek words for love, hopefully we're all familiar with. There's agape, philos, eros, and storge. Agape is the great unselfish, God's love, unconditional. It's an action and not a feeling. Philos, we'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. Eros is the physical, sexual love. Storge is the natural affection between parent and child. And so what he's doing is he's using 2 compound words in each verse. Both have philos, which has the idea of love, maybe a little affection, but I'll suggest something more in a minute. So the word he uses in verse 1 is Philadelphia. You ever been to Philadelphia? Philadelphia is called the city of brotherly love. And that's the literal translation of the name. City, Adelphia, brotherly love, philos. And so, that's the NIV translate that as love one another. All right, well, what about verse 2? It has philoxenia. No, that's not the flower. Xenia. And it comes from the Greek word xenos, which means stranger. See where this goes? It says, love the stranger. It has said, love the brothers, love the stranger. And it's translated here as hospitality. Show hospitality to the strangers. So we're getting an idea that the idea of hospitality is far more than a meal or just opening your home, right? But the writer of Hebrews 13 gives a really interesting, and I'm going back to one of the older translations here because it kind of what sticks in my mind. For by showing hospitality, some have entertained angels unaware. They have served and helped angelic messengers from God in ways that they never even imagined. They didn't even know about it, okay? So, remember the Hebrews is written to Jewish Christians, and there are at least 4 stories that should have come to their minds. And we'll just very quickly, the story of Abraham, when he gets the message, and actually it's a dual message. One is that Sarah is going to have a child, and the second is that God is going to destroy Sodom. And these 3 men have appeared, and Abraham had showed them hospitality. The second one is a continuation of that story. 2 of them go into Sodom and tell Lot, and again, the hospitality. In Judges 6, the story of Gideon, an angel appears to him, "Hail, mighty warrior," and calls him to lead. And the story of Manoah in Judges 13. Manoah was the father of Samson. So think about the messages that are being brought by these angels, which in the text they are identified that way. So their encounters with heavenly messengers in human form. And so the Hebrews 13 in verse 2 is talking about the fact that in the Old Testament, people entertained, they served, they helped angels without even realizing it. And most of the cases, it involved foot washing. You know, I know you think people who've been journeying. Abraham washed their feet and then served them, and the meal was pretty well included in all of that. So the point is that angels were unknown to the host. They were just people. They were just helping ordinary people as they do it. Hospitality was a genuine act of service without an ulterior motive. I mean, think about it. I mean, if I have an ulterior motive in doing something for you, I don't know if you've ever had the experience that you're doing something for somebody and they look back at you and they say, "What do you want?" That kind of kills it, doesn't it? And they did not know what the outcome was going to be. So why did they do it? All right. Number one, because Jesus went around doing good. That's the way he summed up in Acts 10:38. That's not the whole summation, but that's just kind of as he was going. And I like to encourage Christians to realize that the nature and character of God's people is to do good. To do good, to do right in all things. And just when Jesus talked about the turning the other cheek and going the second mile, isn't he talking about the fact that doing good helps disarm evil? I mean, if you can reciprocate evil with good. You know, many years ago, I had somebody that kept phoning me in the middle of the night, drunk, and boy, he was just miserable. And you know, I was always tempted to tell him where to go, but I thought, no, I'm not going to do that. I am going to respond in kindness, graciousness. And some years later, I had the privilege of baptizing him. So, as you think about, as we think about doing good, being hospitable, and I'm going to suggest, as I said earlier, that I think hospitality, while it has the word philos in it, that by its nature and by the way it seems to function, that there's an element of agape in there. Agape being defined as doing what's right for the other person without concern for self. You know, not worried about what's in it for me, but rather how I can help you. And so that's why I think hospitality does it. So Jesus said, then when you give a luncheon or dinner, do not invite your friends, your brothers and sisters, your relatives, or your rich neighbors. If you do, they may invite you back, and so you will be repaid. You know, when I was young, I read that, so what's wrong with that? But his point is that when you are doing good for God, we don't get anything out of it, other than the knowledge of the fact that we've been able to help somebody. And maybe the possibility of sharing. So reaching out to strangers. All right, I'm going to editorialize a little bit here. When we talk about reaching out to strangers, we often go to the idea, and I think of it in terms of inviting them to church. And I'm not saying that's a bad idea. Through my life, I have knocked on and invited hundreds of people to church. But how many people came? I have a step-nephew, I found out the other day, that's going up to Alberta in a couple of weeks to door knock. Now, I don't want to say anything to discourage him, but I know that our culture and our time, that's really not going to be a highly effective way of doing it. Now, 1 Corinthians 14, Paul acknowledges the possibility of visitors in the assembly. You know, we may have visitors in church, but we need to recognize the reality is that they may not understand what's going on. You know, in chapter 2, verse 14 of 1 Corinthians, Paul talks about the idea that spiritual things are discerned by who? Spiritual people. That the natural or the physical man is unable to comprehend the things of the Spirit. So, for example, Glenn kind of touched on it a moment ago when he was leading singing, and talking about listening to some of these songs that were done by Elvis, who was performing it. And a visitor comes into our assembly. And what are they expecting? Performance. They're expecting it to be something that is a show for them to watch and to enjoy. But they don't understand the fact that the assembly of the church is a one another experience. That we are teaching and admonishing one another, that we're working it together as a congregation, and we are each using our abilities to that purpose. So Paul says in 1 Corinthians 14, let everything be done for, older translations say edification, and we go, huh? Building up the body. Or as the passage is about singing, talk about teaching and admonishing one another. So, given that idea, and given the idea that, you know, that the church is about primarily the assembling of ourselves together, that we may have visitors present, and so we need to be mindful of and sensitive to visitors. And realize that they may not understand what we're doing or why we're doing it. They may not understand why somebody's up front and struggling with their words, or not singing very well. That's a lousy performance. But they may have done it with heart. And they may have touched us by the fact even that they were willing to get up and do that. So I appreciate when I visit congregations where they take the time even to a brief explanation for visitors about what we're doing and why we're doing it. Where did Jesus meet and connect with people? Well, first thing you probably need to think about the synagogue. Well, how's that lecture? Well, number one, he wasn't the local preacher. And in fact, he would be invited sometimes to speak, but that would be, but more so, it would be in the streets or in homes, especially tables and meals. And some of the great moments of his ministry in his life were at tables with people. Why? Because it's an informal setting. It's a neutral setting, really. It's not you coming into my church building. It's us sitting down to share a common meal. So I'm going to make a few suggestions here very quickly. Because I think we can kind of maybe see hospitality in ways of turning this. All right, we use the word koinonia, which is translated as fellowship, which means to have or share in common. We had dinner together, and what do we often call that? Fellowship. Well, what we're doing is we're sharing a meal, and a non-Christian can share in that meal with us without any significance with that. But sitting with us, conversing with us, getting to know us, and us getting to know them, is a way of building bridges that can lead to opportunities. To be open and welcome. And I'm thinking especially as we think about the world coming in to Manitoba, and just the rush that has been. It's unbelievable. And to be accommodating and flexible. You know, when we meet somebody new, you know, I feel like I'm the one that needs to give. They don't give to match me. I need to give to match them. I need to do what I can to make them comfortable. think about a couple things. To enjoy and value the multicultural experience. We need to let people that we come in contact with, whoever they are, whether they're native-born Canadian, whether they're First Nation, whether they are from Nigeria, Ghana, the Caribbean, Philippines, China. So we need to learn. Ask questions. You know, people want to share their life story. They want to share what they do, what they like, how they pick their food, whatever. And be genuine. Have people who are genuinely interested in knowing that. People's identities are often defined by their language, their customs, their culture, their food. So if they encounter a, quote, Canadian who doesn't care, is not interested, doesn't want to share, what's the message that they're getting? We need to open those doors as much as possible. And in dealing with multicultural situations, Paul talks about this in talking about eating meat offered to idols. And Jesus has a similar statement that he makes when he gives a limited commission. Eat what is set before you without asking questions. You know, we've had situations, and Diane and I are the beneficiaries of the hospitality and the generosity of people from all over the world, and it's just fabulous. But you can sit down and have see something on your plate, and as long as it's not wiggling and squirming and moving, that we've needed it. We've tried it. And you know, sometimes they will be kind of laughingly putting it in front of you, knowing that there's a strong probability you're not going to appreciate it. But you know, and one of the things that for me, and I'll tell you quite honestly, is that I have a reputation among our internationals that I enjoy really, really hot food. Like, knock the top of your head off hot. And I've had people that have brought things just for me, hot sauces, or you know, rice dishes, especially. And I would just say, on a practical thing, most of the world eats rice. So if you don't like rice, deal with it. All right, I want to end with this thought. Okay, we've been talking about philoxenia. What is xenophobia? That word stranger is there, right? Xeno. But phobia means fear of. I've seen visitors from other parts of the world come into a congregation. And there have been, sometimes it's just one or two, who followed them around, keeping an eye on everything they did, very suspicious about the strangers among us. And I really appreciated, you know, that lesson because these are, you know, people are afraid of the others. We need to have a view of others that sees them as brothers that are not yet born. That we want to reach out to share and show them love of strangers, not fear and suspicion.